They didn't just dig up the graves, they brought them to court. In the fall of 1947, in a small Tennessee county most people have never heard of, 3 generations of one family made a decision that would haunt American legal history. They exhumed the bodies of their own ancestors, loaded them onto trucks, and drove them across state lines. Not for a proper burial, not for respect, but to prove they had the right to marry. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It isn't legend. This happened. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is why no one wants you to know about it. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Fields family had been in Hancock County, Tennessee for 5 generations before anyone thought to ask what they really were. They farmed tobacco. They attended church. They voted in local elections. By all appearances, they were white. But in the summer of 1946, when 17-year-old Dorothy Fields tried to marry a young man named Robert Briggs, the county clerk refused to issue the marriage license. Not because of her age, not because of any moral objection, but because someone, somewhere in the clerk's office, had heard a rumor, a whisper that traveled through the hollow like smoke. The Fields family, they said, had black blood. In Tennessee, in 1946, that rumor was enough to destroy everything. Under state law, any person with even 1 drop of Negro blood was legally classified as colored. And marriage between a white person and a colored person was not just illegal, it was a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Dorothy and Robert could have walked away. They could have moved to another state, changed their names, started over. But Dorothy's father, Samuel Fields, made a different choice. He decided to fight. Not in the way you might expect. Not with lawyers and arguments about justice. But with the dead. Samuel Fields knew that proving whiteness in 1946 Tennessee meant proving bloodline. It meant documentation, birth certificates, census records, photographs. But none of that would be enough. Not when the accusation had already been made. Not when the whole county was watching. So Samuel did something that no one in Hancock County had ever seen before. He went to the family cemetery, the one tucked back in the woods behind the old homestead, and he started planning an exhumation. He would dig up his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather. He would bring their bones into the light, into a courtroom, and force the state of Tennessee to look at what whiteness really meant. He would make them prove, bone by bone, that his daughter had no right to marry the man she loved. The exhumation began on October 14, 1947, just after dawn. Samuel Fields arrived at the cemetery with his 2 brothers, his eldest son, and a man from the county who'd agreed to oversee the process. No clergy, no ceremony, just shovels and a truck with a canvas tarp stretched across the bed. They started with Samuel's father, buried in 1893. The ground was hard, the grave was shallow. When they broke through the wooden coffin, there wasn't much left. Fragments of bone, scraps of cloth, a skull that had partially caved in on one side. They placed everything into a pine box and moved to the next grave. By noon, they had opened 4 graves. 4 generations of Fields men, pulled from the earth and laid out in makeshift containers. Samuel's grandfather, who fought in the Civil War for the Union. His great-grandfather, who'd migrated from Virginia in 1828. Each body told a story of decay. But Samuel wasn't looking for stories. He was looking for proof. Proof that could be measured, documented, presented to a judge who would decide whether his family had the right to exist as they always had. The men worked in silence. No one from the town came to watch. No one from the church offered prayers. This was something beyond ceremony. This was desperation made visible. The bodies were loaded onto the truck and driven 60 miles south to a hospital in Knoxville. There, a team of doctors and anthropologists waited. Men who specialized in what they called racial identification. They had tools, calipers to measure skull dimensions, charts that classified bone structure by race, techniques developed during the eugenics movement, now being used in courtrooms across the South to determine who could marry whom, who could vote, who could own property. The doctors examined each skeleton. They measured the nasal aperture, the shape of the jaw, the angle of the femur. They took photographs. They wrote reports. And then they made their determination. According to the medical examination, the field's ancestors showed no evidence of Negro ancestry. The skull shapes were consistent with Caucasian classification. The bone density, the skeletal proportions, everything aligned with what the doctors considered white. The report was signed, notarized, submitted to the Hancock County Court as evidence. But here's what makes this story unbearable. It worked. The court accepted the findings. Dorothy Fields was granted the right to marry Robert Briggs. The family was legally declared white, and 4 men who'd been resting in the ground for decades were reburied, their bones having served a purpose their lives never intended. They had become evidence in a trial that should never have existed. What the court records don't tell you is what happened inside the Fields house in the months that followed. Dorothy married Robert in a quiet ceremony in November of 1947. There were 12 people in attendance, no reception, no photographs that survived. The marriage license was framed and hung in the hallway of the Fields home, not as a celebration, but as proof. Proof that had cost the family something no one wanted to name. Samuel Fields never spoke about the exhumation again, not to his wife, not to his children. When his grandchildren asked about the graves, about why some of the headstones looked newer than others, he would leave the room. But silence doesn't erase memory, it ferments it. Dorothy's younger sister, Rebecca, began having nightmares 3 months after the wedding. She would wake up screaming about men with shovels, about her grandfather's face appearing in the bedroom window, about bones scattered across the kitchen table. The family doctor prescribed sedatives. The pastor suggested prayer. But Rebecca wouldn't go near the cemetery anymore. She wouldn't even walk past it on the road. Years later, when she was interviewed by a local historian, she said something that never made it into the official record. She said the family had made a bargain they didn't understand, that they'd disturbed something that shouldn't have been touched, not because of superstition, but because they'd turned their own ancestors into instruments of a system designed to measure human worth in inches and angles. The doctors who examined the bones never faced consequences. Their names appeared in medical journals. Their techniques were cited in other court cases across Tennessee, across Georgia, across Mississippi. The racial classification system they helped legitimize would remain in effect for another 20 years. Families across the South would face similar accusations, similar demands for proof. Some would succeed, most would not. The difference often came down to money, to whether you could afford to hire the right doctors, the right lawyers, the right undertaker willing to dig up your dead in the middle of the night. The Fields family had just enough. Barely. Samuel sold 40 acres of farmland to pay for the legal fees, land that had been in the family since before the Civil War. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. The system didn't care about truth. It cared about measurement, about whether your ancestor's skull fit into a predetermined category invented by men who believed humanity could be divided into neat, scientific boxes. The Fields family won their case not because they proved they were white. They won because their bones happened to match a chart created by eugenicists in the 1800s. If the nasal aperture had been 2 millimeters wider, if the jaw had angled differently, the outcome would have been different. Dorothy would have been classified as colored. Her marriage would have been illegal. Her children, if she'd had any before the trial, would have been illegitimate in the eyes of the state. Everything hung on bone structure, on the shape of a dead man's skull. The story might have ended there, buried like the ancestors who'd been disturbed, if not for what happened in 1962. Dorothy Fields Briggs died in childbirth at the age of 33. Her 4th child, a son, survived. The funeral was held at the same church where she'd been baptized, where she'd married Robert 15 years earlier. But when the family went to bury her in the Fields cemetery, they discovered something that no one had prepared for. The graves that had been opened in 1947 had sunk, not just settled, collapsed. As if the earth itself had been hollowed out beneath them. Samuel Fields was 71 years old by then. He stood at the edge of his father's grave, watching as the groundskeeper tried to explain the subsidence, the soil erosion, the natural processes that cause ground to shift over time. But Samuel wasn't listening. He was staring at the depression in the earth, at the way the headstone had tilted forward, and he was remembering something he'd tried to forget. The morning of the exhumation, when they'd first broken through his father's coffin, there had been a smell. Not decay, something else, something chemical and wrong. The doctor from Knoxville had called it formaldehyde, said it was common in older burials, but Samuel had known his father's burial. There'd been no embalming, no chemicals, just a pine box and a Presbyterian prayer. Dorothy was buried on the opposite side of the cemetery, far from the disturbed graves. Robert Briggs attended the funeral but left Tennessee 3 months later. He remarried in Ohio and never returned to Hancock County. The 4 children were raised by Samuel and his wife. None of them were told the full story of how their mother had gained the right to marry their father. They knew there'd been a legal issue. They knew something about race had been questioned. But the details, the exhumation, the courtroom with the bone measurements, and the medical testimony, all of that was kept from them. Samuel believed he was protecting them, but what he was really doing was passing down a silence that would calcify into something harder than bone. Rebecca Fields never married. She lived in the family house until 1989, when she died of a stroke at 63. In her belongings, her nieces found a journal. Most of it was mundane, shopping lists, church notes, recipes, but there were 7 entries, dated between December 1947 and March 1948, that described dreams. The same dream, repeated with slight variations. In it, Rebecca is in the cemetery at night. The graves are open, but instead of bones, there are mirrors at the bottom of each hole, and when she looks into them, she sees her own face. But it's measured, calipers pressed against her temples, hands tilting her jaw, a voice reading numbers. And then the mirrors crack, and she wakes up. She wrote, in the last entry, that she believed the family had been split in 2, not by race, but by the act of making their ancestors prove something that should never have needed proof. The Tennessee law that forced the Fields family to exhume their dead wasn't repealed until 1967, when the Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia struck down all racial marriage bans in the United States. 20 years after Samuel Fields loaded his ancestors onto a truck, 20 years after Dorothy stood in a courtroom while men debated the shape of her grandfather's bones. But the repeal of a law doesn't erase what was done under it. The scars don't disappear just because the knife is put away. The Fields family carried something forward that had no name, a knowledge that their place in the world had once depended on disturbing the dead, that their whiteness, their rights, their very legitimacy had been measured in millimeters and certified by men who saw bodies as data. By the 1980s, most of the family had scattered. Samuel's grandchildren moved to Knoxville, to Nashville, to cities where no one knew the story. The old Fields homestead was sold to a developer who turned it into a vacation property. The cemetery remained, barely maintained, slowly being reclaimed by the woods. Teenagers from town would sometimes dare each other to go there at night. They'd heard stories, not the real story, but fragments, rumors about graves that had been dug up, about a family cursed for disturbing the dead, about bones that still walked at night looking for the rest they'd been denied. Folklore grows in the space where truth is too painful to speak. In 2003, a graduate student from the University of Tennessee named Michael Garrett was researching the history of racial classification laws in Appalachia. He came across a footnote in a legal journal, a brief mention of a case in Hancock County where skeletal evidence had been used to determine racial status for marriage eligibility. The citation was incomplete. The court records had been misfiled, stored in a basement in a box labeled Miscellaneous Domestic Disputes. Michael spent 6 months tracking down the documents. When he finally read the full case file, he sat in the archives, reading room for 2 hours without moving. Later, he would say he felt like he'd opened a grave himself. Michael tried to find surviving members of the Fields family. Most had changed their names or refused to talk. But he eventually located one of Dorothy's daughters, living in Florida, who agreed to speak with him on the condition of anonymity. She told him that she'd only learned the full story when she was 40 years old. Her uncle had gotten drunk at Thanksgiving and started talking about the exhumation, about how Samuel had wept while loading the bones, about how the whole family had agreed never to speak of it because speaking of it meant admitting what they'd been willing to do to be considered white. She said her mother never talked about the trial, never mentioned it, but she used to have a recurring habit that no one understood. She would go to the cemetery alone, once a month, and sit by the graves that had been opened, not praying, not crying, just sitting, as if she were keeping watch over something that might escape if left unattended. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Michael Garrett published his findings in 2006 in an academic journal that almost no one outside of legal history circles would ever read. The article was titled Posthumous Testimony, Exhumation, and Racial Proof in Post-War Tennessee. It was thorough. It was documented. It was also carefully sanitized. The academic language stripped away the horror of what had actually happened. It turned a family's trauma into a case study, a footnote in the larger story of American racial law. But Michael knew what he'd really found. He'd found evidence of a machinery so efficient, so normalized, that a family could dig up their own dead, and no one in power questioned whether that was a reasonable thing to ask of human beings. The article caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story. She contacted Michael. She tried to reach out to the remaining Fields descendants. Every single one refused. No interviews, no photographs, no participation. One family member sent a letter that said simply, "Some things should stay buried." The filmmaker abandoned the project, but the story didn't disappear. It circulated in the way dark stories do, whispered in academic conferences, mentioned in podcasts about forgotten American history, shared in online forums dedicated to genealogy and racial identity. Each retelling sanded down a few more edges, made it a little more bearable, a little less real. But here's what none of those retellings include. In 2011, the old Fields cemetery was vandalized. Someone, probably teenagers, had gone in at night and knocked over several headstones. When the county sent someone to assess the damage, they discovered that 3 of the graves that had been exhumed in 1947 had collapsed entirely. The ground had given way, creating depressions deep enough that you could see fragments of the old coffins. The county filled them in with dirt and gravel, reset the headstones, and filed a report. But they didn't investigate further. They didn't check to see if the collapses were natural, or if something else had caused them, because asking those questions would mean acknowledging what those graves represented. One of Samuel Fields' great-grandsons, a man named Thomas who'd moved to Virginia and worked as a high school history teacher, decided in 2015 that he wanted to see the cemetery. He'd heard pieces of the story growing up, but never the full truth. He drove to Hancock County, found the overgrown path, and walked into the woods alone. He later described what he saw in an email to Michael Garrett. The cemetery was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 20 graves total. The 3 that had been exhumed were obvious. The ground around them looked wrong, disturbed in a way that couldn't be explained by time alone. Thomas stood there for an hour, trying to feel something. Anger, sadness, connection. But all he felt was a kind of hollow bewilderment. These men, his ancestors, had been turned into evidence. Their bones had been measured and catalogued and judged. And then they'd been put back in the ground as if that could undo what had been done. Thomas took no photographs. He never went back. The last person who remembered the exhumation firsthand died in 2019. A man named Earl Fields, Samuel's youngest son, who'd been 11 years old the morning they opened the graves. He'd watched from a distance, hidden behind a tree, because his father had told him to stay at the house. Earl saw them lift the boxes, saw the way his father's hands shook, saw his uncles turn away when the smell hit them. He carried that image for 72 years. In his final weeks, in a nursing home in Knoxville, he told the story to a nurse who was changing his bed sheets. She thought he was confused, hallucinating. She wrote in her notes that the patient was experiencing delusions about grave robbing. She had no idea he was telling the truth. The Hancock County Courthouse still has the original case file in its archives, the marriage license application, the medical reports with their measurements and classifications, the judge's ruling that declared the Fields family legally white. These documents exist. You could request to see them. You could hold in your hands the paperwork that required a family to exhume their ancestors to prove they had the right to love whom they chose. But most people don't know the case exists. It's not taught in Tennessee schools. It's not mentioned in civil rights museums. It exists in that strange space where American history hides the things too uncomfortable to integrate into the narrative we tell ourselves about progress and justice. What happened to the Fields family wasn't an anomaly. It was the system working exactly as designed. A system that defined human worth through measurement and classification, that created a world where your grandmother's skull shape could determine your legal rights, where disturbing the dead was considered reasonable if it meant maintaining racial boundaries. Dozens of families across the South faced similar demands. Most of their stories were never documented. Most were lost to shame and silence and the deliberate erasure that comes when a society doesn't want to remember what it was capable of. The Fields family's story survived only because a graduate student found a footnote, because one case file wasn't destroyed, because fragments of memory persisted despite every pressure to forget. Today, the Fields cemetery is almost impossible to find. The path has been swallowed by undergrowth. The headstones are covered in moss and lichen. No one maintains it anymore. There are no living descendants in Hancock County. The family name exists now only in these records, in academic articles that almost no one reads, in the memories of people who are dying. And maybe that's what the family wanted, to let it all disappear, to let the graves sink back into the earth and take the story with them. But disappearance isn't the same as resolution. The violence doesn't evaporate just because we stop looking at it. It settles into the soil. It becomes part of the landscape, part of the ground we walk on without knowing what lies beneath. The question isn't whether the Fields family made the right choice. They were given no good choices. They were trapped in a system that demanded the impossible and called it law. The question is what we do with stories like this, whether we let them sink into the ground with the bones, or whether we keep them alive, uncomfortable as they are, because they tell us something true about what this country has asked of its people, about the bargains we've made with our own dead, about the price of whiteness in a place that made race into a religion and measurement into morality. The Fields family paid that price. And somewhere in the woods of Tennessee, in graves that keep collapsing no matter how many times they're filled, the evidence remains.